useless Labour government are doing the impossible. They're actually making things worse. They really are. Look who we've got running the country at the moment. Free gear Keir. Or never hear Keir. We've got Rachel from accounts. We know her, don't we? Angela Rayner, the no-brainer. You got Mad Miliband, that net zero fanatic. And let's not forget our very own mastermind, David Lammy.
The UK witnessed one of the most scandalous political trials of the last decade when Keir Starmer found himself at the centre of a financial crisis that turned out to be nothing more than an artificially created illusion. His government, which for months had warned the public of impending economic disaster, found itself complicit in one of the biggest manipulations of financial data the country had ever seen. The whole affair, which began as an attempt to justify economic brutality, eventually led to a split within the Labour Party and sparked a storm of public outrage. Beginning with claims of an existing £22 billion deficit, these lies only exacerbated the financial problems that the government promised to solve, but instead became just a tool for political manipulation. When Keir Starmer's government first announced the financial deficit that had exacerbated the economic situation, it was accepted by most people as an inevitable reality. Starmer announced that Britain was on the brink of economic collapse, and in order to avert disaster, the country would have to take tough measures. He promised that it would be a difficult but necessary path, including tax hikes, drastic social cuts, and other austerity measures. All of this was presented as saving the nation from imminent financial ruin. With each new investigation, however, it became clear that behind all these statements there was not a real economic crisis but a carefully planned political strategy. The problem was not that the deficit really existed, but that its size had been exaggerated or even fictionalized to justify the decisions made.
He's a proper chopper, isn't he? You know what, here at Reform UK, we've got Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Rupert Lowe, all successful businessmen and politicians. We've got Zia Youssef and Nick Candy, again, in the back room, all successful businessmen. We've also got now Elon Musk and President... and President Trump as friends of Nigel. But who do Labour have speaking out for them? Carol Vorderman and David Lammy. What a load of rubbish that is.
When independent experts began to examine the data on which the government's entire plan was based, they uncovered gross inconsistencies. It turned out that the figures so insistently cited were not based on objective analysis, but rather on old forecasts that used inflated figures and ignored many key economic factors. These figures were used as a weapon in the struggle for political influence, creating the illusion of a disaster that required immediate and drastic action. The lack of objective basis for the government's claims only increased suspicions that the figures may have been manipulated deliberately to advance the Labour Party's political agenda. When the Starmer government repeated over and over again that the country was on the brink of financial collapse, it used not only numbers but also psychological pressure on the population. Every day, new predictions of disaster appeared on television and in the newspapers, and every interview with the minister or Starmer himself ended with calls for urgent action. This approach was designed to make Britons feel that they could wait no longer and that government action was the only way to avoid disaster. The exaggeration of the threat was created to not only justify action but also to ultimately control public opinion. The more fears spread among citizens, the easier it was to promote economic measures that under normal circumstances would have caused widespread protest. Meanwhile, independent economists and experts began to expose the lies behind the catastrophic forecasts. They showed that the data on which the financial threat was based did not match reality. It was not just an accidental glitch or calculation error, it was a deliberate manipulation aimed at creating the appearance of a crisis. The revelations that emerged in public and economic circles began to show that the figures on which the financial projections were based were wrong from the start, and some had been manipulated to create panic and justify harsh measures. But even despite these revelations, Starmer and his government continued to insist that they had made the right decision. This, in turn, only increased discontent within the Labour Party, as many MPs and party leaders began to question the veracity of the claims. Over time, it became clear that this financial manipulation not only jeopardized the credibility of the government, but also led to an internal split within the party. Those who had supported Starmer began to increasingly doubt his integrity and professionalism. In private meetings, candid admissions began to be made that the data on which the entire plan was based was questionable, to say the least, and the methods of obtaining it left much to be desired. This was the signal to start looking into the matter publicly, and soon leaks began to emerge that the government was using fake data to create a false threat. The internal political crisis engulfing the Labour Party led to more and more MPs beginning to refuse to support Starmer's policies. In parallel, the public perception that the government was using fear as a tool of manipulation to justify economic measures that would never have passed under normal circumstances began to grow. Protests and public actions became a constant companion to the political situation. People who had not previously thought about politics became more active in voicing their discontent. Workers, pensioners, and small businesses began to gather in the streets, demanding honest answers to questions about why they had to pay for a deficit that didn't really exist. All of this created a storm of criticism that eventually led to the Starmer government coming under severe pressure both from within and outside. All these events led to the old government becoming not just politically vulnerable, but actually losing control of the situation. The illusion of a financial crisis was crumbling, and with it Starmer's political ambitions crumbled. With each new revelation, it became more and more obvious that the whole crisis was nothing more than an elaborate political spectacle that not only deceived the public, but also jeopardized the future of the political careers of its creators. But this strategic manipulation of numbers and facts was not a simple mistake. All of the data on which the whole deficit scare was based was inflated and inaccurate, as independent economists and analysts have confirmed since the crisis was first exposed. However, Starmer and his cohorts were not going to give up so easily. They continued to exploit fear by creating a sense of extreme urgency about the situation. Their narrative of financial collapse became more memorable and powerful by the day, and their main goal became to convince the public that tough measures were not only reasonable but necessary. Following this, they began to actively utilize the media platform to push their agenda. The media, which was in a so-called political alliance with the Labour Party, relentlessly repeated claims that the country was on the brink of financial disaster and that the government's proposed austerity measures were the only way out. The media were used to convince the public of the absolute rightness of the government's decisions and to impose the idea that opposition to these decisions was the path to financial ruin. The more the repeated reports of P's 22 billion were heard from TV screens, newspaper pages and radio airwaves, the more real this threat became in the minds of citizens. It wasn't just manipulating the facts, it was playing on people's psychology. When information is repeated long enough, it begins to be accepted as true reality, no matter how much it was initially exaggerated. The challenge for Starmer and his team was to create a powerful sense of fear and urgency. A regime of if we don't act immediately, we will collapse was imposed on all sectors of society. The total austerity measures that resulted from this artificially inflated crisis were presented as inevitable. Opposition, objecting economists, and independent analysts were quickly silenced, and the whole debate was that salvation could only come through the tough measures proposed by the government. And if you doubt the rightness of the government's actions, then you are an enemy of economic stability, someone who risks ruining the country. The Labour media played a special role in supporting this narrative, effectively becoming propaganda sharks that actively worked to create panic. Rather than questioning or investigating the veracity of the P's 22 billion figures, these media simply replicated the government's claims, supporting the idea that the UK was on the brink of financial collapse. All journalistic work was reduced to repeating the government narrative. This became not just a perversion of the facts, but a full-fledged campaign to instill fear in the masses, creating a sense of hopelessness in the public while simultaneously setting them up to make unpopular decisions. But no matter how much they tried to hide the real causes of the crisis, cracks in this narrative began to appear. This was sounded by independent economists and financial analysts, who began to publicly declare that the data presented did not match the real situation. Independent studies were showing that the deficits were greatly exaggerated and built on outdated or manipulated data. But this wave of criticism was quickly quelled by political press releases designed to prop up the existing narrative, creating a new layer of suspicion and accusations against those who were trying to expose reality. The task facing the government was obvious: to create a sense of chaos and crisis in order to propose its political program as the only true solution, justifying all steps by raising taxes and cutting social programs. In some places it worked. Because as experience shows, when society is gripped by panic, it is ready to support almost any measure just to maintain some illusion of stability. When the revelations about the manipulation of financial data began to gain publicity, the consequences for the government of Keir Starmer became inevitable. What began as quiet doubt soon grew into a powerful political revolt, both inside and outside the Labour Party. More and more MPs who had previously supported the government's course began to publicly express doubts about the accuracy of the data used to justify the massive austerity measures. Cracks began to appear within the Labour Party, which had long remained a solid political force. At first it was cautious hints and doubts in private meetings, but soon open calls for a review of the financial statements were growing louder. Some of the MPs admitted to feeling cheated, and this posed a real threat to Starmer's political stability. Just as importantly, political opposition soon joined this internal discontent. Conservatives, reformers, and even some liberal Democrats began actively demanding an independent inquiry into the origin and accuracy of the $22 billion deficit figures. This political reign did not stop, and the pressure on Starmer grew ever stronger. Questions were being asked not only inside Parliament, but also on social media, where users were actively debating how the government could have deceived millions of citizens by using false data to justify its economic measures. Social media became an important battleground for public opinion, and more people began to question the veracity of the government's claims. The massive dissemination of information about financial manipulation eventually sparked outrage in the streets. Protests in major cities became frequent, and they were not limited to political activists or opposition parties. Workers, pensioners, small entrepreneurs, all those who had been hit by harsh economic measures began to take to the streets, demanding explanations. These demonstrations were a clear expression that citizens were no longer willing to remain silent as they watched their lives deteriorate due to policies based on deception. With each new protest, the question of the veracity of economic data became more pressing. In response to the growing crisis, Starmer tried to maintain his power by holding press conferences and issuing public statements claiming that the erroneous data was merely a misunderstanding and not part of a deliberate manipulation. However, such excuses could no longer satisfy the public. The internal divisions within the Labour Party only intensified. Total dissatisfaction among members of the government reached such a level that leaks began that several senior politicians no longer supported Starmer. One by one, MPs began to openly admit that they had been warned against using inflated figures and manipulating data, but they were hesitant to go against the party line. At some point, however, many realized that silence had cost too much, and now the moment of open rupture had arrived. Then, when the situation seemed almost hopeless for Starmer, his party faced its first real blow: the resignation of a high-profile minister right on air. That moment was a turning point. The statement by the minister, who blatantly pointed out errors and lies in the financial reports, shook public opinion and made Starmer's continued existence as party leader almost impossible. Keir Starmer's political career was in danger of being completely destroyed. But the most serious consequences came when the veracity of the whole financial picture began to be discussed at the level of government investigations. The Conservatives and opposition parties demanded an inquiry into how the government had managed to manipulate public opinion on deflation and the deficit. Questions about why the $22 billion figures had not been properly audited by independent financial auditors became a major topic of debate. There was a real threat to the reputation not only of Starmer but of the entire Labour government, which now found itself under the scrutiny of Parliament and the press. What was even more dangerous for Starmer was that the $22 billion situation was not just a matter of economic misconduct or miscalculation. It was a question of credibility. The government's laboratory of political lies had led people to question not just the financial statements but the very principles of government itself. Soon even those who initially supported the Labour Party began to renounce their party beliefs, seeing the government's actions as nothing more than political manipulation and a desire to hold on to power at all costs. With each passing day, the situation became more and more threatening for Starmer. Public discontent was growing and more people began to ask why they had to suffer from high taxes and cuts in social benefits when there was no real financial crisis. Under such circumstances, Starmer's stability began to seem quite impossible. The more the public demanded explanations, the more his own supporters and colleagues began to distance themselves from him. Against this backdrop, the threat of resignation grew, and what had seemed like a minor misunderstanding began to develop into one of Britain's most serious political upheavals. Thus, the exposure of the financial fraud was not just a blow to the Starmer government. but the beginning of a new political crisis in the country, where the government found itself at the center of a powerful stream of accusations of manipulation of public opinion.